Picture this. It is late November 1841. You've got this massive 251-ton wooden sailing ship, right? And it's secretly racing toward the really rugged southern coast of Australia, coming from all the way across the world in freezing Canada.
10,000 miles, yeah. That is a massive journey for the 1840s.
It is. And the ship, the William Salthouse, is carrying this absolute fortune in cargo. We're talking salted meat, building supplies, and, bizarrely enough, vintage French champagne.
Which is such a wild mix of goods.
Right. So it's plunging into the churning water just outside Port Phillip Bay. It's rushing toward this exploding frontier encampment that is practically starving for these supplies. The crew is, just miles away from a massive payout.
Almost at the finish line.
Exactly. And then tragedy strikes. They hit a submerged rock off Point Nepean. The rudder completely tears away. The hull floods. And the William Salthouse just vanishes into the churn, sinking right to the bottom of the bay.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is it settled into this massive underwater sand ridge. The brutal tidal currents there just quickly buried the whole thing.
Which honestly saved it.
Oh, totally. The ship sat down there, completely undisturbed. It was like this state of suspended animation for 140 years. It wasn't actually until some sport divers accidentally stumbled across the timbers in 1982 that we even realized what was down there.
Which is just incredible. Welcome to today's deep dive into the source material. We are taking you straight to the bottom of Port Phillip Bay to explore the archaeological findings of the William Salthouse.
It really is the ultimate time capsule.
It is. We are looking at a perfectly sealed snapshot of 1841. And the data pulled from this specific wreck gives us this unprecedented look at, the gritty physical mechanics of early global supply chains, the desperate realities of frontier survival, and the incredibly complex high-tech battles required to preserve our submerged cultural heritage today.
Yeah, but I think to really understand it, the story of the William Salthouse actually begins long before it hit that rock. We have to look at the economic forces that put it in those treacherous waters in the first place.
Because they technically weren't even supposed to be there, right?
Exactly. This vessel was not on a standard authorized run. Its very presence in Australia was legally dubious.
Yeah, so looking at the sources, the ship was built in Liverpool in 1824, and it spent like 17 years running a pretty standard route to the West Indies. But then this new firm, Green & Company, buys it, and they completely divert its trajectory.
They had a very different plan.
Right. The William Salthouse becomes the first recorded merchant vessel to attempt a direct trade route from the British Dominion of Canada straight to the Australian colonies. And doing that openly flouted the British navigation laws of the era.
Yeah, and those navigation laws were essentially the backbone of British mercantilism. I mean, the entire imperial economic model relied on controlling the flow of goods.
So London always gets its cut.
Exactly. Colonies were supposed to send raw materials to London, and then London would send manufactured goods back. So trading directly between two distant colonies like Canada and Australia that cut the imperial center out of the loop entirely. It meant London wasn't taxing it or controlling the market.
Risking the wrath of the entire British Empire means the merchants saw a payoff that justified the potential fines or, even the seizure of their ship. And that payoff was Port Phillip, which is the settlement we now call Melbourne.
The boom town.
Yeah, the population data from the source material is staggering. Just between 1839 and 1841, Melbourne exploded from a population of about 5,000 to over 20,000 people.
It's hard to even wrap your head around a demographic boom of that magnitude. It completely overwhelmed the physical environment. Imagine tens of thousands of immigrants just pouring off ships into a landscape that has absolutely no established agricultural infrastructure.
Just people everywhere living in tents.
Yeah, they hadn't built the flour mills to process wheat. They hadn't established a large-scale timber industry to build houses. It was essentially this massive encampment of people with money to spend, but absolutely nothing to buy. I mean, flour prices were doubling and tripling by the week.
It's like a massive, high-stakes grocery delivery for a town that is multiplying in size overnight and literally has no way to feed itself. Which, raises a fascinating question about information flow in the 1840s.
Yeah, how they even knew to go there.
Right. A merchant firm in Canada doesn't have a telegraph or the internet to tell them Melbourne is starving. They are relying on letters and rumors carried by other slow-moving sailing ships.
Months of delay.
Exactly. By the time Green and company heard about the crisis in Port Phillip, the information was already a month old. They took this massive speculative gamble, basically hoping that by the time they loaded a ship and sailed it halfway across the globe, the people in Melbourne would still be starving and willing to pay exorbitant prices.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that speculative risk is really the defining feature of 19th century global capitalism. You have this highly responsive, opportunistic, mercantile network that hears about a supply vacuum and immediately moves to fill it, completely regardless of imperial trade law.
They just don't care about the rules.
They really don't. They bypass the traditional networks, load up a 12,000-pound cargo, which was an absolute fortune at the time, and sail straight for the crisis zone.
Which brings us to the actual cargo. Because this was a 12,000-pound grocery run, what exactly did they pack in the hull? This is where the archaeology becomes so vivid.
It really is.
Because the William Salthouse was buried in that protective sand ridge, the cargo hold didn't disintegrate. Archaeologists excavating the site found what amounts to an exact physical receipt of an 1840s frontier survival kit.
Yeah, so looking at the manifest, it included English iron, sawn timber, and 26 casks of nails to help build those desperately needed houses.
Basic construction stuff.
Right, and they carry Canadian whiskey and American flour, clearly stenciled with the brand Lachine Mills. Fine. But the bulk of the cargo, the real calorie-dense lifeline for the colony, consisted of 1,086 wooden casks of salted meat and fish.
Which is wild, finding over 1,000 wooden casks underwater after a century. That sounds impossible. Wood rots.
Usually.
Yeah. But the anaerobic environment, the lack of oxygen in that buried sand layer, it preserved the cooperage. And the barrel-making technology of the 1840s was surprisingly highly standardized.
It was a huge industry.
Yeah, so archaeologists recovered these intact cask heads, which are the flat wooden lids of the barrels, and they essentially acted like 19th century barcodes. The merchants had branded and stenciled these lids with inspection dates, the weights of the meat, the specific grade of the cut, and even the names of the inspectors back in Montreal, like W. Moore and W. Watson.
Which is amazing because those cask heads act as a tracking system. It allows us to trace the physical movement of food across the empire. But the contents of the barrels revealed something even more interesting about historical food preservation.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
Right. When the archaeologists opened these casks, they found the animal bones still packed inside with the salted meat.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because my immediate thought reading that was about the physics of shipping. You are sending a wooden ship on a 10,000-mile journey where cargo space and weight are at an absolute premium. Why on earth would they ship heavy bones in salt meat halfway across the world instead of just stripping the meat and leaving the skeletons in Canada? It seems incredibly inefficient.
Well, historians actually debated that for years, assuming boneless meat was the standard. But the faunal analysis from the William Salthouse proved that the 1840s wet salting process required the bones to remain intact.
Wait, required them?
Yeah, it comes down to the mechanics of osmosis and structural integrity.
Okay, because to preserve meat for a multi-month voyage without refrigeration, you can't just sprinkle a little salt on a steak. You have to actively force the moisture out of the cellular tissue.
Exactly. So the butchers would cut the animal into very specific geometric chunks. They'd rub those chunks with dry salt to initiate osmosis, drawing the water out of the meat. Then they would pack those chunks incredibly tightly into wet coopered barrels.
Meaning barrels designed to be completely watertight.
Right. And finally, they filled any remaining air pockets with a heavy liquid brine. If they had removed the bones, the sheer pressure of the packing and the chemical breakdown from the brine would basically turn the meat into an unrecognizable mush.
Ah, so the bone acts as like a structural scaffold.
Yes, it keeps the geometric cut intact so it physically survives the journey.
That makes so much sense. And the bone surviving actually gives modern archaeologists a massive analytical tool. The researchers noted which bones were in the barrels. They found ribs, vertebrae, and upper limb bones, but they did not find heads, snouts, or lower feet.
Because the Canadian contractors were selectively butchering the animals, they packed the high-utility, meaty cuts for the premium export barrels and left all the low-yield scraps behind in Montreal.
Which means if an archaeologist is digging up a land site in modern-day Melbourne and they find a 19th century garbage pit filled with pig snouts and trotters, they immediately know that animal was raised and slaughtered locally. But if the pit only contains neatly sawed ribs and vertebrae, they are looking at the diagnostic signature of imported, barreled Canadian salt meat. It physically differentiates local husbandry from global trade.
It is a brilliant forensic marker. But, those branded cask heads also revealed a pretty stark discrepancy in the cargo's quality, exposing the somewhat predatory nature of this specific voyage.
Yes, the prime mess scam.
It's pretty shady. So the inspector's brands showed two very different batches of meat. You had casks of pork inspected in June 1841, right before the ship departed. Those were branded prime pork, which is a high-quality grade.
Makes sense for an export.
But deep in the hold, archaeologists found a massive secondary batch of casks that had been inspected 6 months earlier, back in December 1840. And those were branded prime mess.
And the term prime mess might sound acceptable, maybe like a slightly different cut. But the archaeologists took those brand markings and cross-referenced them with Canadian historical records.
Yeah, they did some serious digging.
They went back to the Montreal Gazette from early 1841, and the market reports in the newspaper explicitly listed prime mess pork as a neglected grade. The domestic Canadian market flat out refused to buy it.
Because it was old, low-grade stock.
Exactly. So Green & Company basically took their expired, low-grade, unsellable warehouse stock, loaded it onto a ship, and aimed it at a captive audience. It's like a modern company dumping their expired stock on a remote customer.
They knew the people in Port Phillip were too desperate to turn away calories, regardless of whether it was fresh prime or 6-month-old prime mess.
We're starving. They're not going to be picky.
Right, and the customers were 10,000 miles away. They couldn't exactly demand a refund. It perfectly captures the ruthless calculus of colonial trade. The frontier gets the dregs because the frontier has no leverage.
It's brutal, but here's where it gets really interesting. Buried underneath those barrels of neglected salt pork and basic flour, the archaeologists uncovered a completely different narrative.
Oh, the luxury goods.
Yes. They found hundreds of intact bottles of French champagne, Sauternes, and Muscat.
Which is just wild to think about. Luxury goods, shipped in bulk alongside literal emergency rations. And because the ship sank into that protective anaerobic sand we talked about, many of the bottles survived with their corks still firmly in place.
The corks were stamped with the letters AY inside a circle, tracing the champagne directly to the village of A in the Champagne region of France. And the preservation was so pristine that maritime archaeologists didn't just catalog the bottles. They organized professional wine tastings and chemical evaluations.
Yeah, they actually drank the 140-year-old shipwreck wine.
I mean, I would be so tempted.
Well, they brought in oenologists, scientists who study the chemistry and biology of wine and winemaking. And the goal wasn't just a novelty tasting. It was a really rare opportunity to establish a physical, chemical baseline for 19th century viticulture.
Because you can read old texts about how wine was made all day long.
Exactly, but actually testing the chemical composition of a 140-year-old vintage offers hard, undeniable data.
And the results were fascinating. The oenologists confirmed the use of Pinot Noir grapes and discovered something really interesting about the palate of the 1840s. The chemical analysis showed that these early sparkling wines had a significantly higher sugar composition than the dry champagnes we drink today.
Yeah, high sugar content in 19th century wines often served a dual purpose. It reflected the taste preferences of the era, sure, but it was also a functional byproduct of early fermentation technology.
Functional how?
Well, sugar could help mask flaws in the wine, or even stabilize it for long, turbulent sea voyages before modern temperature controls existed.
That's brilliant. But beyond the chemistry, the sheer presence of genuine French champagne on a ship rushing to relieve a starving colony paints a very vivid sociological picture.
It really does.
It physically documents the extreme class divide in early Melbourne.
Yeah, because you have two completely different realities occupying the exact same muddy frontier town. On one hand, you have an exploding population of working-class immigrants who are desperate enough to eat 6-month-old, low-grade salt pork.
Whatever they can get.
Right. But on the other hand, you have this newly rich, land-speculating elite class getting fabulously wealthy off the real estate boom. They're demanding imported French champagne, and the global mercantile network is more than happy to supply it.
The William Salthouse is basically holding both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum in a single cargo hold. Finding this intact ecosystem of 1841 life was a total miracle. But, the archaeologists quickly realized that the greatest threat to the ship wasn't the submerged rock it hit in the 19th century.
No, not at all.
The greatest threat was the 1980s.
Yeah, this is the really tragic part of the story. When the wreck was discovered in 1982, it was resting in only about 10 to 13 meters of water. Word spread immediately through the sport diving community, and the site became a huge target for souvenir hunters.
Everyone wanted a piece of treasure.
Exactly. Divers started ripping up the fragile, waterlogged timbers, tearing through the cargo hold, looking for bottles or whatever they could find. They were destroying the archaeological context of the site within months of its discovery.
So maritime archaeologists had to intervene immediately. In 1983, they conducted emergency test excavations to map the site and basically save what they could. But here is the brutal paradox of underwater archaeology.
It's a catch-22.
It really is. The moment you uncover a shipwreck to study it, you expose it to the very elements that want to destroy it. And the hydrodynamic forces at Port Phillip Heads are incredibly violent.
Yeah, so the William Salthouse sits on the Nepean Bank, which is an area dominated by tidal currents that can reach up to 7 knots. For 140 years, the ship survived because the currents had naturally deposited this massive sand wave over the hull.
It was in a perfect state of equilibrium.
Exactly. The sand locked the oxygen out and protected the wood from the sheer physical force of the water.
But when archaeologists dug trenches to access the cargo, they completely altered the physical shape of the seafloor. We can think of it like putting your thumb over a garden hose. When you restrict the flow of water, it speeds up. By digging a trench around the hull, the archaeologists inadvertently created a channel that forced those 7-knot currents to accelerate as they moved over the wreck.
And that acceleration causes a phenomenon known as scouring.
Which sounds bad.
It's very bad. The fast-moving water creates these powerful vortices that essentially dig into the seabed, stripping away the supporting sand. So the protective sandbank began to vanish, leaving the fragile wooden hull completely exposed to the crushing force of the tidal currents.
The ocean was literally tearing it apart. The archaeologists scrambled to reverse the damage. They tried laying down physical sandbags over the site, but the ocean simply battered the bags and washed the sand away.
It didn't even make a dent.
No. So then they tried using underwater machinery to hand dredge sand back over the hull, but the accelerated currents stripped it away as fast as they could pump it. They were just flat out losing the battle against the physics of the ocean.
Yeah, to stop the scouring, they needed to find a way to slow the water down without building a rigid physical barrier that the ocean would just destroy. They had to look entirely outside the field of archaeology, and they found a product called Cegrass.
So what does this all mean for us today? Because Cegrass is basically an artificial seagrass matting made of synthetic plastic fronds.
Fake grass.
Yeah, fake grass.
Yep.
It was originally engineered by the offshore oil industry to solve the exact same problem, preventing scouring around underwater pipelines. It's so ironic using a modern industrial plastic product to save a fragile 19th century wooden ship.
It's pretty amazing. The archaeologists took this industrial plastic product and deployed it all around the perimeter of the 19th century wooden hull. It cost roughly 100,000 Australian dollars, which is actually a remarkably cost-effective solution for marine conservation.
And the mechanics of the seagrass are brilliant in their simplicity.
Right, because the artificial fronds don't try to stop the water like a solid wall.
They just create drag.
Exactly. They slow the current down just enough that the suspended sand particles in the water column lose their momentum and literally just drop to the seafloor.
So the plastic grass forced the ocean to rebuild the sandbank for them. It naturally reburied the stern of the ship, locking it safely away from the currents and the oxygen. Using industrial fake grass to save a historic shipwreck is just this incredible out-of-the-box triumph.
It was a huge watershed moment in marine conservation. But, the long-term observation of the William Salthouse reveals a critical caveat about underwater cultural heritage. You never truly save a site permanently.
Right, because the ocean is always changing.
Exactly. These shipwrecks exist in highly fluid, dynamic environments. Decades after the seagrass successfully reburied the ship, archaeologists returned to the site and found that the scouring had reemerged.
Wait, really? After all that?
Yeah, the currents had shifted again. And the reason they shifted brings the story of the William Salthouse full circle in the most ironic way possible. The hydrodynamics of Port Phillip Bay changed because of modern channel deepening and dredging.
Because the Port Authority was digging deeper channels to accommodate massive 21st century global cargo ships.
Exactly. The modern shipping industry, moving modern bulk goods, altered the tidal flows enough to threaten the physical remains of the 19th century shipping industry.
Oh, wow.
It just proves that preserving history isn't a one-and-done event. It requires an active, ongoing relationship with the environment.
The continuous thread of global commerce is so striking when you frame it like that. We look at a vessel like the William Salthouse as ancient history, but the underlying mechanics haven't changed at all.
Not really, no. Whenever you see a massive container ship pulling into a port, or, you click order on a package originating from a factory halfway across the world, you are participating in the exact same web of supply, demand, and risk.
The merchants in 1841, bypassing imperial laws to chase a demographic boom, were operating on the exact same speculative logic that drives our supply chains today. The technology evolved from wet-coopered wooden barrels to steel shipping containers, but the economic imperatives are identical.
Yeah, unpacking a single doomed voyage provides this pristine cross-section of humanity at that exact moment in 1841. It captures the low-grade prime mess pork, meant for the desperate working class, the French champagne destined for the colonial elite, and the modern ingenuity required to keep all of it from washing away into the ocean.
It completely changes the way you look at the mundane logistics happening all around us. Think about the cargo ships anchored outside your city's port today.
Millions of tons of cargo.
Right. If one of those massive vessels were to sink right now, and archaeologists uncovered it 140 years from now, what would our modern cargo tell the future about us? What would the specific mix of our bulk goods, our luxury electronics, and our Amazon packaging reveal to an archaeologist about our society's survival priorities and our own class divides?
It would be a perfect mirror of who we are right now.
Exactly. Someday, the disposable cardboard boxes arriving on our doorsteps will be someone else's meticulous archaeology. We will leave you with that image to mull over the William Salthouse, sails full, rushing toward a submerged rock, carrying the lifeblood of a city that didn't even know it was coming. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive